Hello, my name's Teresa McKinnon. I work as Senior Tutor for e-learning at the Language Centre at the University of Warwick. And I want to talk to you a little bit about the creation of a virtual French exchange that happened as a result of a serendipitous conversation arising over a blog post on Steve Wheeler's blog, Learning with Ease. It was through that blog that I bumped into somebody called Simon Enser, who is talking to you today. And he suggested that it might be an idea if we looked at connecting some learners. Something that has always been of interest to me. To give you a bit of background, I was a teacher for 15 years in secondary education before coming to higher education. And spent many hours setting up virtual exchanges and twinning arrangements in the schools where I was responsible for language teaching. So the idea appealed to me immediately, but I knew, having spent some time researching e-learning and working in online settings, that there would be a lot of challenges. So I knew we would have to think about how we did this. And through a collaborative process, really, we've evolved an approach that I think, both now are quite excited about. So that's what I'm going to tell you about today. So I've called the title Flower Vases and Irises, and that perhaps will become evident shortly. So one of our initial premises that was very important, really, was to look at the ways that we currently connect learners and connect to learners in the real world, and to look at the challenges that they present. There are very many different ways of providing learning spaces, and the fact really that we acknowledge that learning doesn't just happen in a classroom. In fact, an awful lot of learning happens socially beyond the classroom. So we didn't want to replicate the mistakes, if you like, of the physical buildings designed for so-called learning. We wanted to provide a fertile place for students to find their own spaces and to learn in their own different ways and connect in their own different ways. However, from a pragmatic point of view, it was necessary in the first instance to actually find a space where we could put everybody together virtually so that they could begin the process of connecting. Now, creating flexible spaces in online environments is a huge challenge, not just because of the learning curve involved and the the technological understanding that may be required to function effectively in that environment, but also because digital environments are essentially a set of ones and zeros, and so you get presented right from the outset with a set of limiting choices. The Language Centre had recently established, at the time we were thinking about this virtual exchange, a platform using Moodle for delivering learning support for language learners. So the obvious place really to start was actually our Moodle, because it was very easy for us to include external visitors to that Moodle and help people to connect. So that became our seedbed, if you like, the fertile land that we wished to use to plant our seeds, just to help students find each other in the first instance. We were very aware of a desire that really from there we would want to facilitate movement beyond Moodle. But initially, students would meet up through the Moodle interface. So we set up a course, the Échange Warwick-Clermont course within our Moodle, and we set up accounts for students both on the French and the English side to connect and to browse each other's profiles as participants. And that was our first we had a couple of launch events, physical launch events on both sides of the channel, but that was our first virtual meeting space. Now, what really was exciting, I think, that came out of those initial meetings was the way in which the students very quickly showed us their digital awareness. As soon as they were in Moodle, we were using My Moodle so that students could personalize their space. And as soon as they arrived in the space, they populated it with their digital identities. And you can see from the collection of images here that these were students who were actually very comfortable in an online space on the whole. They were very quick to set up their profile and to make that part of the course reflect their own online identity. They were aware of the audience, the other students around them, the eyes of other students browsing through their profiles. They decided how much information they wanted to make available to those people, and in many cases shared their identities in locations other than Moodle as well, and started to browse the collection of students that were there. And there were around 500, in fact just over 500 students altogether, around half English and half French. They clearly showed that they had a level of sophistication in their online communication, even at the outset in terms of their management of their online persona through Moodle. So what happened fairly quickly afterwards, really, we sort of started the ball rolling with a few activities, online activities, but very quickly we found that students were connecting with people and then having ongoing conversations in lots of other different places. We provided in the Échange course, in the Moodle course itself, RSS feeds that were bringing back information from these other places into that central point, so that students could drop back into the course and see what others were doing. So hashtags were used in Twitter, for example. The hashtag WarClaire was for posts on Twitter in English, relevant to the Warwick-Clermont exchange, and Claire War was for postings in French. And we also used Paper LI for both sides of the channel and brought RSS feeds through there that was bringing in additional wider information about the area around Warwick and the area around Clermont, so that individuals could start to get a feel for those spaces and those physical places. There was very little active reference within class time to the exchange. The exchange was very much an optional extra and a way of enriching their learning beyond the classroom and extending their learning. And we started to see engagement from the students in debates and discussions, in correcting each other's learning and language, sometimes miscorrecting it, but that's fine. They were engaging with each other and having these discussions and making connections, and just sharing things that were of general interest to them. We also made a campus-based instant messaging tool that used to be known as Wimber Pronto and is now Blackboard's Instant Messenger. We made that available to students, and that was very quickly downloaded. That proved to be very popular as well. We had 125 downloads of that very, very quickly. Students liked the whole instant messaging idea, but conversations were taking place in there. They were also taking place in Facebook, in Twitter, sharing of photos and music through various channels. Google Plus was quite widely used on the French side, not so widely used on the UK side. Facebook, a student set up a Facebook page, and again that was entirely generated by the students, these sorts of activities. And we could see, therefore, that people were finding people they wanted to have conversations with and engage with. The only directed activity came in the form of a teacher-led language learning history, where we asked students to reflect on their past experience of language learning. And in doing that, using a partner, and that was a randomly chosen partner given to them by their teacher, they had to create a short presentation or Word document describing their language learning history in the target language, the language they were learning, using their partner as their language advisor and editor, if you like. That helped students to reflect on the sort of factors that affect their language learning. So that was the only really directed activity that happened. Everything else was social. There was a lot of engagement in games online and things like Angry Birds competitions, and we've had quite a lot of demand for online game playing as well between the two communities. So it was as much about the social as about the learning. So seeing this sort of activity and knowing that in fact we might get some really useful information about the process of language learning and the role of social networking in language learning, Simon and I decided to ask students permission to do some research in this area. So we sent out a research consent form, and generally that was fairly uncontentious. Students were happy to give us some feedback about their experiences within the area on the whole. And we then also gave the task of identifying a project logo to some design students on the Clermont side. And that's what they came up with here. You can see the clavier logo. Clavier is the French word for keyboard, but also sort of conveniently spells out Clermont-Ferrand, Warwick, Virtual Interactive Exchange Research. Now that is ongoing. A questionnaire has been issued. We so far have had 137 replies. We're still waiting for more. And as you can see from the analysis of the replies so far, there's a high level of comfort and familiarity amongst these students with computer-mediated communication, certainly amongst those who've replied so far. Many of them have followed up interactions. If I sort of spelt out the whole breakdown of that 81%, you'd see that the majority of those are 10 or more interactions, which over a period of around 10, 12 weeks is all things that perhaps they wouldn't have been able to do otherwise. The interesting point that's coming out of it, and there will be others I'm sure, is the lack of engagement generally in online conversations with people other than those who speak their first language. And that is a challenge, and that's particularly of interest, obviously, to us as language learners, because actually we need students to be multilingual actors within online environments, and not just restricted to conversations with people who speak their language. And that would just replicate and duplicate the already sort of fractured nature and atomized nature of conversations that happen. We need international actors, people who can move across boundaries if we're to have an active role in controlling and negotiating the new global environment. And certainly the young people now and of the future will need to be more familiar in those sorts of environments. It's actually very important as well that these sorts of facilities address the inequalities that exist in terms of access to education and interaction with and control of learning. The online facilities do help those who are naturally shy in a social situation, or perhaps reticent to communicate with people who are unfamiliar. to think about how they negotiate these communications and to actually make themselves a little bit more visible in sensible ways and in safe environments. Also, we have to be able to address the imbalance of access that's available, particularly due to cost of owning equipment and paying for access to the internet. So free Wi-Fi situations help to free us from some of that cost-driven implication. The smartphones happen to be reasonably cheap in France, and we're seeing quite a lot of use of smartphones in France. So we're very aware that we want this as a portal to continue and to be available in mobile ways. And this all helps us. The research in this area is helping us to gather data about the nature as well of the interactions that are happening in these environments once they are made possible and made reachable to as many people as possible. So early days yet, but we're hoping to get some really useful information from the study that we're doing in this environment. So finally, back to my flowers and my vases. Well, where was I coming from there? Essentially, the flowers in the vases are a metaphor for our individuals within our classroom. They're each one isolated from the other because we tend to encourage that sort of infrastructure. Everybody has their social role within a classroom, and often they're very aware of competition between them. So there's very little social activity supported and encouraged within classrooms. So that flower in that vase may thrive for a while, but it will always be limited. In a more open setting, if you take your irises, well, in an open setting like a woodland, they shoot out rhizomes, just as our students reached out to one another. And the result of that is greater interaction and a population that's more widespread and connected, that is more tolerant and understanding, and that helps to build a collective, collaborative approach in their learning and support all learners. What we started to see, I think, is a very well reflected in this latest model suggested for M-learning here by Kearney in Research in Learning Technology, which is an open resource that I really recommend you have a look at. When those students arrived in Moodle, they were allowed to personalize, they were able to personalize their space and customize their space, and they became agents and active agents within that space. They started to collaborate and have conversations, they shared information. They were also able to be themselves, their authentic selves, and to start to negotiate some of the issues of international communication and intercultural communication. So that makes the activity that resulted situated, contextualized, and very authentic. The interactions were very much prompted and led by the individuals themselves, even though, of course, other activities were going on around them that may have prompted and led to interesting interactions. These were natural, living, growing communications rather than artificial, forced situations. So the result of that is a spontaneous collection of interactions. A lively thread on one of the forums within our Moodle portal settled around the Occupy movement, which clearly was an international movement, and it was very interesting to see people discussing that from their different contexts and using it as an opportunity to share fairly deep philosophical discussions around the role of international management of finance. So that was a great opportunity to actually collect and see the sorts of interactions that arise naturally rather than in a so-called authentic environment within a classroom. This was real authenticity. So hence, you can see and perhaps compare and contrast these two images. I think I would far rather have a woodland populated with irises than even many, many flowers in vases. I would rather see the living, breathing organism at work over the artificial, imported, decontextualized plant in a vase. So I hope that's given you an overview of the work that we've done. I'm finding it very exciting. I think there's a lot of things to come out of it. As with any project, there'll be things that we'll refine and change. But it has been very exciting to see how the project has progressed.